guys, welcome back to Reading with Teachers. We are here back with Lewis Carroll through the Looking Glass. This time I've got my blanket with me, so let's dig in. Chapter 4, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm around the other's neck. Alice knew which was which in a moment, because one of them had Dum stitched on his collar and the other had D. I suppose they've got Tweedle stitched at the back of their collars, she said to herself. They stood so still that she forgot they were alive. She was just about to look at the back of each collar for Tweedle when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked Dum. If you think we're made of wax, he said, you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing, nohow. Here they are. Contrariwise, added the one marked D. If you think we're alive, you should speak. I'm very sorry, was all Alice could say, but the old song kept ringing through her head. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so, they quite forgot their quarrel. I know what you're thinking about, said Tweedledum, but it isn't so, nohow. Contrariwise, continued Tweedledee, if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be. But as it is, it isn't, it ain't. That's logic. I was thinking, Alice said very politely, which is the best way out of these woods? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please? But the fat little men only looked at each other and grinned. You've begun wrong, cried Tweedledum. The first thing in a visit is to say, how do you do, and shake hands. And the two brothers gave each other a hug. Then they held out the two hands that were free to shake hands with Alice. But don't be shaking hands right now because of the coronavirus. We bump elbows and we stay 6 feet away and say hi and wave. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first for fear of hurting the other one's feelings. So she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment they were dancing round in a ring, and Alice found herself singing, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. This seemed quite natural, but it certainly was funny, she thought. The other two dancers were fat and soon out of breath. 4 times around is enough for one dance, Tweedledum panted out, and stopped dancing as suddenly as they had begun. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. I hope you're not too tired, she said at last. No how, and thank you very much for asking, said Tweedledum. So much obliged, added Tweedledee. You like poetry? Yes, some poetry, Alice said hesitantly. But would you please tell me which road leads out of the woods? What shall I recite to her? Said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes and not noticing Alice's question. The Walrus and the Carpenter is longest, Tweedledum replied, giving his brother a hug. Tweedledee began instantly. The sun was shining. Alice interrupted. If it's very long, she said as politely as she could, would you please tell me first which road? Tweedledee smiled gently and began again. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4, to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye, and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, you know, they hadn't any feet. Four other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock, conveniently low. And all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar, besides, are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice. The carpenter said nothing but, cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing but, the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer there came none. And that was scarcely odd because they'd eaten every one. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because you see he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise. That was mean, Alice said. Then I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat as many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she was alarmed by something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the woods near them. She was afraid it was a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here? She asked timidly. It's only the Red King snoring, said Tweedledee. Come and look at him, both the brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hand and led her up to where the king was sleeping. Isn't he a lovely sight? Said Tweedledum. He had a tall red nightcap on with a tassel, and he was lying crumpled up into an untidy heap and snoring loudly. I'm afraid he'll catch cold lying on the damp grass, said Alice, who was a thoughtful little girl. He's dreaming now, said Tweedledee. And what do you think he's dreaming about? Alice said nobody could guess that. Why, about you, Tweedledee exclaimed, clapping his hands. If he stopped dreaming about you, where do you suppose you'd be? Where I am now, of course, said Alice. Not you, Tweedledee snapped. You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a thing in his dream. If that were the thing the king was to wake, Tweedledum added, you'd go out, bang, just like a candle. I would not, Alice exclaimed. Besides, if I'm only a thing in his dream, what are you? I should like to know. Ditto, said Tweedledum. Ditto, ditto, shouted Tweedledee. Hush, you'll wake him, said Alice. I'd better be getting out of the woods, for it's getting dark. Do you think it's going to rain? Tweedledum opened a large umbrella over himself and his brother and looked up into it. No, I don't think it is, he said. At least, not under here, nohow. But it may rain outside? It may, if it chooses, said Tweedledee. We've no objection, contrariwise. Selfish things, thought Alice. She was just going to say goodnight when Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella. Do you see that? He said as his eyes grew large. He pointed a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under a tree. It's only a rattle, Alice said. Only an old rattle, quite old and broken. I knew it was, cried Tweedledum. He stamped about wildly and tore at his hair. It's spoiled, of course. He looked at Tweedledee, who was trying to hide under the umbrella. Alice tried to soothe him. You needn't be so angry about an old rattle. But it isn't old, Tweedledum cried in a fury. It's new, I tell you, my nice new rattle. Then he looked at Tweedledee and calmly asked, Of course you agree to have a battle. The two brothers went off hand in hand and returned with blankets, pillows, rugs, and coal buckets, and Alice helped them dress for battle. Alice thought they were quite silly. It took so long to get bundled up in their blankets and helmets that Tweedledum suggested, Let's just fight till 6 o'clock and then we'll have dinner. Very well, said the other. She can watch. And all this fuss about a rattle, said Alice. There's only one sword, you know, said Tweedledum to Tweedledee, but you can have the umbrella. It's quite sharp. Only we must begin quick. It's getting dark as dark can be. And darker, said Tweedledee. It was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a thunderstorm coming on. What a thick black cloud that is, she said. And how fast it comes. Why, I do believe it's got wings. It's the crow, Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm. The two brothers took to their heels and were soon out of sight. Alice ran a little way into the woods and stopped under a large tree. It can never get at me here, she thought. It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees. I wish it wouldn't flap its wings so hard. It makes a quite windy in the woods. Oh, there's somebody's shawl being blown away. The end. All right, chapter 5 is next time, Wool and Water. Shout out to my seniors at Sunnyside High School. Hi, guys.